America looks like. We are no longer majority white and Christian. 2046, we're going to be majority black and brown. We all need to celebrate that. Diversity enables us to be a stronger democracy and a stronger country. And the strategy is to create momentum behind these, a momentum that will spread these lawsuits to other states.
We're at a moment in history where we either act muscularly and directly, or we're going to be mowed over by a theocracy that knows no limits. And frankly, my own Presbyterian faith led me to conclude that that's just not a society we can live in.
I put together this group. It's got almost 100 members. We've called it Hoosier Jews for Choice, and we are figuring out what we're going to do next.
You will hear from community organizations working daily to disrupt the purposeful and callous disregard that produces results like this legislation.
I know that we are all very disheartened, hurt, and angry by this bill that's going into effect tomorrow, but we really cannot stop now.
It's devastating to think of a world that we must live in as women without our human and equal rights. Banning abortion nationwide would lead to a 21% increase in the number of pregnancy-related deaths overall, and a 33% increase amongst Black women.
Laws like this only care about the fetus. The mother, she's expendable. And that's why it's not Jewish, it's not rational, it's not humane, and it's not something that we should ever abide by in Florida or in the United States.
Thank you so much.
We are going to speak on behalf of Hoosier Jews for Choice. In the Jewish tradition, we conduct a ritual called Havdalah. Havdalah is a ceremony that separates between the holy day of Shabbat and the everyday. It separates between rest and work, between lightness and darkness. And so on this evening, we would like to mark this separation between having abortion rights and not having abortion rights with a modified Havdalah ritual. As we mark this separation and acknowledge our pain, we must also think about the responsibilities that we carry forward, our obligations to show up for those most impacted by this decision. There is work to be done, and I know that all of us here will continue to do that work.
All right, I'd love to have our panelists up here. Hi, everyone. My name's Umbreen Bhatti. I'm the director of the Athena Center for Leadership here at Barnard, and just really excited to have this conversation. This is the second time I got to watch this film, and it got me both times. So thank you. So I want to introduce our panelists. I'll ask you to just wave when I say a little bit about you, because your bios are not written in the order you're sitting, so thank you. So Paula Eisveld is an award-winning director and a producer known for her journalistic rigor in telling timely and intelligent cinematic stories led by strong-willed characters, and this is her film. Her previous films are 93 Queen and Aftershock, and this premiered at Sundance, is that right? Smriti Krishnan is the manager of government relations and advocacy at the National Council for Jewish Women, where her portfolio focuses on reproductive justice and where she leads the litigation strategy. She was previously a staffer in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. Rabbi Mira Rivera, rabbi in residence and board-certified chaplain, was born in Detroit, this is my favorite fact, came to New York City to dance for Martha Graham and stayed. Let's see. Since ordination at the Jewish Theological Seminary, she's been uplifting the voices of Jews of color and teaching nationally as rabbi in residence for the Lunar Collective. With the National Council of Jewish Women, she advocates for reproductive justice and the Jewish movement for abortion access. Shelley Henry is an attorney dedicated to representing individuals in employment and other civil rights actions, also serves as counsel to the Planned Parenthood affiliate serving Kentucky and EMW Women's Surgical Center. She serves on the board for Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. Jamie Manson is president of Catholics for Choice, and for 12 years was a columnist at the National Catholic Reporter, where she was the only openly lesbian journalist in the Catholic media in the world. She was an often solitary voice for reproductive freedom and justice, and was one of the first to sound the alarm about the right-wing push for religious freedom. So thank you all for joining us today. So Paula, I want to start with you. Tell us why you made this.
Yeah. Firstly, thank you everyone for coming and for being here. Thank you, Athena, for welcoming me back, and thank you for moderating this panel with all these experts who I hope will do way more talking than I will. But the reason why I made this was a call to action. It was a reaction to the Dobbs decision. It was June 28th. The decision had come out on June 24th, and my good friend and superwoman, Roddy Taylor, called me and said, "We have to do something. We have to make a film. I'll get you the money. There's this case in Florida. We need to do something." And at the time, I was releasing another baby of mine, Aftershock. Shawnee Benton Gibson is here. She is the protagonist of that film. And at first I was like, no, I can't. Like we're doing this, and there's no time. And Roddy was just like, tell me by the end of the day. And I thought about it, and I really couldn't say no to putting my grief and desperation into art and filmmaking. So true to her word, we raised the money. I partnered with Darcy McKinnon, who's an amazing producer, and within 5 months we made this film. Really, it was just a group of women coming together who desperately wanted to do something. So our goal was impact. Sundance, we thought about after. That was not something we were thinking about at the time. It was just to do something hopeful. And these lawsuits were providing hope and a way for people to respond in some way and take our power back on a local level. So that's how it started.
So what do you see as the trajectory? Like, what's the Impact campaign about?
Yeah, so I'm proud to say that within the next couple of weeks, we'll have some distribution that we can share so it will be widely seen. And at the same time, we're working with Picture Motion, that's an impact strategy company, to do impact screenings around the country, from Washington, D.C. to Indiana, of course, Florida, the states that we profile in the film, and really use the film in community centers, synagogues, other mosques, other religious churches everywhere, to get interfaith communities to talk about this, because what the right has done was create this false binary that if you're a person of faith, you must be against abortion, and if you're not, then you love abortion. Like that's kind of how they paint it, and we know that the majority of Americans are people of faith in whatever capacity that is and support abortion. So it's really important to reclaim that and have people of faith talking about this and giving them space to also just talk about abortion.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. So, Jamie, I want to talk actually a little bit about the coalition building and all of the work that I think happened here that I think is so interesting. But I first want to just say that in your bio, you're described as an often solitary voice for reproductive freedom and justice in the Catholic community. Is that changing?
Well, that's such an interesting question. Certainly at my newspaper, my independent Catholic newspaper, but the reality is abortion is very, very popular among Catholics. Very popular. If you remember, 68% of Catholics in this country did not want to see Roe versus Wade struck down last June. 68%, that's a landslide victory. And 1 in 4 abortion patients in this country is Catholic, identifies as Catholic. So this is part of the pain I feel watching this is, these ideas of fetal personhood and life beginning at conception, these religious ideas are Catholic. They were invented by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has enormous power politically, and yet they do not represent the convictions of their own people. And I think that's so important for people to understand that even though these are Catholic theological ideas, their own people do not believe in them, and yet they are being used to oppress and to take away fundamental freedoms. As we often say, Catholics are supposed to believe, we're supposed to respect religious pluralism. We are supposed to believe that religious freedom is not just about protecting someone's right to practice their beliefs, but the right to be free of the beliefs of others. And so that's good Catholic teaching. And so you see just this terrible aberration right now of our faith.
But what about the voice part? Are you finding more Catholics speaking up with you and like you?
That's a big part of our mission for sure, is that we have those numbers, but no one believes it, that many Catholic, because the narrative that the Catholic right wing and the Christian right wing is so powerful. And so a key part of our mission is emboldening Catholics to speak out. And that's everybody from nuns, women religious used to be a part of the clergy consultation service, and Jane, and getting them back to speak out about this. I think there's a lot of Catholics who are able to put their head under the sand, consider themselves very progressive, but don't want to talk about abortion because it's so taboo in the church. And they're now realizing that we lost Roe because of our church. And so there's a moral obligation now, I think, that's rising in Catholics to speak out.
Thank you. Talk a bit, and this I think is probably for Rabbi Mira and Jamie, but really for all of you, how have these coalitions come together? Like, what have they been at work for a long time, or did they really come together in the last year? Talk a bit about that.
I was actually invited by the National Council of Jewish Women to first go down to Washington, D.C., December 2021, and there I met Jamie. And I was struck by the fact that I was the only rabbi. I was the only one. And I understood some of the politics. I was invited. Number one, what have I got to lose, right? I'm a person of color. I'm not what they call a mar de'atra, or the spiritual leader of a Jewish community. By definition, most Jewish communities are European-centric, right? So a person like me would go to a call to action because what has she got to lose, right? She's already lost anyway. She is a rabbi. She finished at really nearby here. My seminary is the Jewish Theological Seminary. But I can throw my life into a cause. But come May 17, 2023, so many of us were there protesting, right? How Roe v. Wade was struck down. So the coalitions I started to see were not only across religions, interfaith. Within those few short months, the National Council of Jewish Women was able to mobilize so many of my colleagues to go out there. And for the first time, I started to hear them saying, I too had an abortion. That was a big shift, major shift.
I told all these folks before we got up here that actually the best conversations are where I say nothing and they just talk to each other. So the floor is very open for you all to do that. But I am curious about the coalitions. Are you finding unlikely partners, like folks you hadn't partnered with before on previous issues where this brought together faith communities that hadn't previously been working together or in contact?
So during that call to action by the Jewish community in May 17, 2023, I remembered being grouped with the heads of the seminaries in those Jewish seminaries. There was the Reconstructionist school dean was there, and president, and I didn't realize that I was brought there to represent the Rabbinical Assembly, right? And also, which is the Conservative Jewish Seminary Union. And I'd always been, I'm an outlier, right? I was the first Filipino-American woman to be ordained by JTS. But there was speaking with the head of Yeshivat Chovei Torah, which is a modern Orthodox seminary, and the head of the Reform, the Reform movement. And so, but it was not official for me to speak for the RA. But yes, I was there proud 50 years. This, my union that I'm an outlier of has been supporting reproductive justice. So even that was like major coalition building amongst us. But my own community that I was working for, we were 2 people. That was it, 2 people, because the leadership of that community did not see it as such an imperative at that time to come out, bring a bus, right? So even the coalition building amongst, within a little community, difficile, it's difficult, it's not easy.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to echo everything Rabbi Meir is saying, and I think this is a really exciting moment in faith-based repro work. I think we recognize the truth that the anti-choice movement is religious. It is not secular. And I think sometimes the pro-choice movement, which is very secular, fights it just on secular grounds. And the fact is that we need to use religious language and we need to use religious imagery to fight back. And so I think that it's an exciting moment. We are rebooting the clergy consultation service, which went dormant essentially after Roe in 1973. And so there's a huge swell of desire for practical and pastoral support coming from all different faith traditions, and also to do that narrative change that has to be done. I think the imam spoke very well. He said the messengers are important, and we see that. And only faith groups can do that narrative change, culture change that's necessary. For all of these faiths to stand up, these Christian faiths to stand up and say, not in our name will you take away fundamental human rights. And so I think it's a renaissance moment for faith-based religious reproductive justice movements.
I love the hopefulness of that, and I agree. As a person of faith myself, that I've always found it very hard to feel like, well, that's for the people who are not religious, and the people who are religious, hate abortion, right? It's not an easy binary at all, and yet I have to move away a little bit from the hope just to ask the lawyers right now, how are things? What's going on with all of these other bans and all of these other states? I know I might have just like, this is what this conversation is, but are there pockets of hope for us besides Indiana?
Do you want to start, or should I, or?
Feel free. I'll jump in.
Okay, so I first want to acknowledge that the legal landscape today is very different than pre-Roe, right? Because now the constitutional right to abortion has been taken away, and so we're now in a new legal landscape. From the language in Justice Alito's opinion, and of course Paula's film, we see that the discussion, the strategy, the work is now even more heavily happening in the states. So, and correct me if this has changed, but the last I checked, there were 13 states which have trigger bans in effect. And a majority of these bans have very, very narrow exceptions for rape and incest, but some of them don't. And so other state legislatures are also continuing to think about, talk about, discuss on the floor, and enact other bans possibly. And I'm going to pause here so you can hopefully provide some of the pockets of hope that our moderator raised.
Well, I wish I could. So when those trigger bans went into effect, that affected 24.5 million people in those 13 different states. It's a tremendous impact. I practice law in Kentucky. We filed a lawsuit immediately after our trigger ban went into effect, and actually were able to obtain a preliminary injunction that allowed reproductive care again in Kentucky. It was short-lived, about a week before the Court of Appeals re-implemented those bans, and then just, frankly, last week, the Kentucky Supreme Court affirmed that decision. And so we don't have reproductive abortion care in Kentucky right now. We are going back to the trial court level, and we are going to continue challenging that. But the Supreme Court's decision was really bad. It was just really terrible. What they held is that we cannot sue using the doctors as plaintiffs, which is just how abortion lawsuits have always been done. Really, third-party standing is what it's called. And it's because it's just so impossible to find a pregnant woman who is able to go and be the plaintiff. But our Kentucky Supreme Court has told us that that's just simply not an excuse, and that we do need to find a pregnant person who is willing to bring that lawsuit on their own behalf. Perhaps more exciting, better news, is that Americans United has just recently filed a lawsuit in Missouri. And so we are challenging the trigger bans there. That lawsuit was just filed, and so it's at the very initial stages. But we have taken a little bit different approach in that we looked at the Missouri Constitution and see that it has much more robust protections for the separation of church and state. And so we have made a constitutional challenge to have all of those bans set aside, and that would provide reproductive care, again, for everybody in Missouri. It's a little bit different approach than some of the other lawsuits that have focused on the RFRA approach, saying that this ban violates my personal religious views, and therefore there should be an exception for my religion. Instead, we're saying it's a constitutional problem, and therefore that ban has to be set aside entirely. We're super excited about that lawsuit, and so I will give you that little bit of hope on that one.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you,
think
that was an emotional roller coaster I just experienced listening to that.
Same for me.
Oh, I was just going to say that, you know, in each state, the dynamics are so different, and the fact that y'all were able to file that lawsuit in Missouri is very hopeful. And similarly, NCJW is also looking at cases around the country at various states and jurisdictions, as other organizations are, to see where we can get involved, where we can file amicus briefs from the perspective of faith-based organization. As Jamie was saying earlier, the conversation is now using more faith rhetoric. How can we talk about people's religion in the context of abortion and vice versa? And so this is a perspective that NCJW is very excited to think about and talk about and work on in various courts around the country. Sorry, sort of just jumped in there.
No, please jump in as much as possible. I appreciate it. So at the end of the day, this is really about our right to control our own bodies, right? It's about our right to exist the way that we want, do what we want with our bodies, look the way we want, and so on. So are you seeing a connection, for example, to the resistance to ensuring that trans youth can access gender-affirming healthcare? Are you seeing a connection to, you know, the right to wear hijab? Like, are you seeing in the coalitions connections to these other issues that I think are linked? Are those conversations happening at all?
Well, so I would say from Americans United, we actually lead a coalition of about 100 organizations that are organizations of faith, that are secular, and also civil rights organizations that work on religious discrimination in a more general sense. And so it does include things like working on these abortion bans, but also transgender equality, marriage equality, all of those different issues where we see religious discrimination affecting other people's rights to pursue their lives the way they wish to.
Yeah, I just want to chime in. It was so important to include Americans United for a Separate Church and State, because really what it ultimately is about is blurring the lines between church and state, and that is the fabric of our democracy. So there's the abortion bans, which are horrific, period, and then is what it doesn't stop at those bans. As you're talking about all the other types of oppression and discrimination, it really is about just taking away democracy. So it was very important to go from Ellie's story, the woman in the film, and then to the Jewish community, then the interfaith community, and then nationally, what does this really mean? And it means that there is not going to be a separate church and state, which is very scary for everyone.
We're seeing it, particularly that intersection with Catholic healthcare, which is an issue we have a legacy of working on, because if you're at a Catholic hospital or Catholic clinic,
which is in so many ways almost unavoidable.
Almost unavoidable, especially if you're in a rural area, or if you're poor. If you're in a Catholic hospital, it's not doctors making your directives, it's bishops. Bishops make the rules in Catholic hospitals, not doctors. And so that affects not only your reproductive care that's available, which is almost nil. You can't get, any kind of trans care. Even your end-of-life care. The bishops have very draconian ideas of what end-of-life care should look like. So this is this deep intersection. And, the fact is that these hospitals are taking billions in public funding and yet have the right to discriminate in this way. So one basic thing we're pushing for as an intersectional justice is for Catholic hospitals to at least have to disclose at the outset what services you can and cannot get, even before you get admitted to this hospital. And so that's a really important place for us to do that intersectional justice.
And so I can see that happening within your community, but in the interfaith communities that are coming together around, for example, 5-alarm fire abortion, is there a sort of thinking about the fact that these issues are connected again to end-of-life care, gender-affirming care and so on? Is that conversation happening within the interfaith alliances?
Yes. Oh, sorry, Rabbi. Richard.
So there's the one that we don't want to talk about, and that's what I would call the hijacking of spiritual verse, scripture, name it. Right? So I had this my visceral experience at speaking in front of SCOTUS in December 2021. Was there we were with our little podium and our coterie of people that came out to protest. And yes, there were cops, that directed us there, and we knew there were protection. But right around us, towering over us, were these huge, huge posters with ripped open wombs and these gigantic biblical verses. And all I could read from those verses was just fear. God is going to get you. Fear. And just blood and guts. And of course, they had their megaphones speaking above. Remember that? Just speaking above us. And I stood there, and I came to this rally as it was early morning. I had my prayer shawl. It's like morning prayer. It was shacharit for me, right? So it was morning prayers for me. And I came with my biblical verse to employ it as like ashrei in this prayer of those who come into this house of truth, this house of prayer, this house of revealing our plight. We're there with full honesty. And I saw a biblical verse in scripture being used to bludgeon us. And yes, this film called it, and the Muslim gentleman called it Christian nationalism, he called it fascism. So that hijacking of the religious landscape made me tremble. I was scared in the same way as I'm going to bring up this vision for some of you, like remember the debate when Hillary Clinton was speaking, and then this looming, large human, this Hulk just kept following her. I felt that. It was like in front of me. It was following, and did any of the speakers, of the moderators say anything to stop this creature? None, nada, nothing. So this is part of the language, and this is part of the hijacking that's not being talked about. And I think all of us faith leaders can really, we have to bring this out. We have to name it.
And I want to make sure we have time for,
Sorry, I keep talking over someone.
I love it. I want you to add everything.
I thought this only happened on Zoom, but it's happening in real life too now. But Rabbi, what you were saying about the importance of language, I think, and what the question also emphasizes, that when we use language to be inclusive, when we use the term, for example, pregnant people, pregnant individuals, we want to make sure that every person in this country is able to access abortion or reproductive health care otherwise. So yes, those conversations are happening in an interfaith manner. They are happening, and not only happening, but we are also very conscious and very, very aware, and making sure that that's the language being submitted, for example, in litigation in our briefs, or that's the rhetoric we're using in public when we're talking about healthcare and abortion and access to it. Because again, we want every person to have that option.
Yeah. Are there questions in the audience at all? Oh, okay, a hand just shot up. What's the question? Perfect, I'll repeat the question. Okay, good. That's the max my short-term memory can hold. So, so I'm going to say that the two questions are, number one, are there actions being considered against pharmacies, these national pharmacies, that are making decisions about what pills to give out and not? And also, is there any, is anyone thinking about ways we can pull federal money from these hospital chains? I think I got that right, and hopefully you. Okay, so a conversation about birth control. So I will throw this to anyone on the panel who's interested in answering.
Well, I'll take a first stab at one of those questions. So I can't really speak specifically to the hospital chains accepting federal money, but I can tell you Americans United has faced this issue in a different context. And so in the last few years, we've filed 2 lawsuits against organizations that provide adoption services and foster care services that are private and religious that have denied the right to become a foster parent to qualified couples or individuals based on the fact that they don't share that same religious view that the organization does. And so we have brought suit in a couple of cases arguing that they are not entitled to state funds because they are discriminating on the basis of religion. The Missouri lawsuit we just filed is also, the plaintiffs are suing based on their taxpayer status because Missouri's constitution doesn't permit the use of tax dollars, public money, to support religious organizations or religious activity. And so that taxpayer status, as somebody who pays taxes, whose money shouldn't go to those organizations, is an avenue to challenge those. And so we have taken that approach in a few different situations.
Just with respect to all the lawyers in the room, and my partner right there is one of them, I think we're going to have to reach a point at some point, folks, where we have to challenge these laws directly, where we can't find a way, a workaround, a legal workaround. We're going to lose our minds trying to find legal workarounds. You know, with the medication abortion, mifepristone could be taken off the market any day now because of an extreme right-wing Christian organization has filed a suit in Texas. These pills are very easy to get, and there are lots and lots of underground networks right now that are getting pills out to pregnant people who need them. At some point, we're going to have to become very brave and just directly challenge these laws. Honestly, we can't find a way.
I just want to mention that Francine from Plan C is here.
Yes, there you go.
And that film is a feature-length film playing at 6 o'clock, which deals with medical abortion pills. So I'm sure a lot of that is going to come up there. And Francine, I don't know if you have anything to add. Sorry that I'm putting you on the spot, but you're the expert.
Kitty, and then there's a hand in the back, and then Jana.
Yeah, I just wanted to second that. As a lawyer who's been doing this for 40 years, we got to give up on the courts. And while it is particularly the federal courts, and that's why I'm so glad, I mean, there was a very robust religious movement for reproductive rights.
Yes.
Decades.
Yes.
That just kind of dropped off in the mid-90s and disappeared. I'm thrilled that you're all enjoying bringing that back, but I wholeheartedly believe that dependence on the courts is not the way to go because the very states who have bad laws have bad judges. And until we have the power to change the legislatures and the courts, we're never going to win this issue. So hallelujah to you. I'm thrilled that you're doing this work, and give up on the courts, guys.
So Kitty, the voice of hope and pragmatism. Just to recap for accessibility purposes, Francine's film is at 6 o'clock, and it's a call to think about different strategies. And Kitty, point well taken. The same states that have bad laws also have bad judges. So we're going to need a lot of strategies. There's a hand in the back.
Right.
I just wanted to share that and get your feedback, and Monica shaking her head in agreement.
Yeah.
I mean, I just want to address that question. It's a fascinating question. And I will say from some of the conversations I've had with clergy members, I've heard concerns, particularly if they live in states with restricted access to abortion, very hostile states, about talking from a public perspective about abortion or reproductive health care. They've shared that they talk to individuals privately so that there are not repercussions negatively for them. I also know of faith leaders who are openly talking about abortion in a public way. So I definitely do think that's a strategy, perhaps not as centralized, but it's definitely happening, I think, from the conversations I've had. And I'll also say that litigation is what I like to look at as a three-pronged strategy. So we have a push for policy and practical things, like Jamie was saying about directly challenging the law, for those who are comfortable enough to take that risk. So we have litigation, we have policy and practical considerations, and then also what I like to call the administrative side of things, like the legislative business. So those are the three prongs that I get to work on, and I think together in conjunction, they can make a substantial difference. I think relying on one strategy over the other is putting all our eggs in one basket, so to speak. So I would definitely say that having all three together is the best way to go.
Yeah, and you know, I'd add that we have actually quite a lot of strategies represented even on this stage, right? So we have, you know, litigation as a strategy. We have conversations that are happening in faith-based communities. I work with students who are very concerned about this, and so students are always thinking about what strategy they can use. They have you know, they live in a different world than I think a lot of us at this moment, and so they see, you know, they're seeing things that we might not be able to see. And so it's really joyful and amazing to talk to students about how they're thinking about how to approach this stuff. So, and of course we have, like, you know, changing public opinion via films. So I'd love, Paula, for you to just say a little bit more about, like, what, from your perspective, what more can we do as, you know, you're a storyteller?
Yeah, I think we need storytelling from everywhere. You know, this film and these films are made to start conversations to exactly like this, have a forum, come up with creative approaches. I also want to just open this up a bit now that we're thinking creatively, that this abortion care is the same as maternal health care, and it's all one conversation. So in the same way that we're looking for legal strategies, we also have to make sure that that when people choose to give birth, that they have the human right to do that, to have a dignified birth, not to just survive, but to thrive, especially for women of color who have very adverse outcomes sometimes. And part of changing that is making sure we have enough providers, making sure that there are laws that will allow midwives to practice, because we don't have enough people to actually provide abortion care. So thank you. So it's really important that as we're worrying, and rightfully, and taking these creative approaches legally, we have to think about the on the ground people that can actually provide the care and the support systems that we need in order to implement this change. Because if it just is in the courtroom, wherever it is, but it's not meeting the people, it's not being brought down to earth, then people can't access that care. So
yeah, and Jana, you had a hand up, and I know you have a question, but I'm actually going to put you on the spot. Jana Meyerowitz-Turner here is one of the smartest strategists I know on this topic. So you think about a lot of different strategies here. Like, you've used really interesting strategies with business and that kind of thing. So please do ask your question, but then please do also talk about some of the strategies you're trying out and employing here. And actually, you know, why don't I just give you the mic so I don't have to use my short-term memory. It may still not go up for accessibility purposes on the streaming, so I'm going to hand you this in case you want to share a bit about the strategies.
Okay, so for at least the next 2 years, we have a Catholic president. And not only is he a Catholic president, it's a very core part of his personal brand, if you will. So if you had his ear and got to talk to him from a faith perspective, give us talking points that we could use for other powerful men in our lives who might, like, how do we call people in like that? And if you had his ear, what would you say in this moment through a faith lens?
Great question. I've been trying to get in the White House for a long time. I get to Gender Policy Council, I get to the faith-based partnerships, I cannot get to him.
I'll say this because people have told me he is who he is.
He is
what
who
I
he
keep
is.
getting.
Yeah, he's a Catholic of a certain generation, as is the former House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, who, even she struggled to say abortion, honestly. We have to be honest, clear about that. First thing I would do is bring a nun in the room, a Catholic nun. He listens to Catholic nuns. The next thing, he does. They have a lot of, and they have moral credibility that bishops don't have in our culture. And I would talk to him about the Catholic perspective on how we make a Catholic argument to support abortion rights. And I would talk about conscience, which Catholics believe in the primacy of conscience, that at the end of the day, and it's right in the catechism, your individual conscience is the final arbiter in all moral decision-making. I talked to him about religious freedom, which again is good Catholic thinking. And then I talked to him about something that I know he believes in deeply, which is social justice. And I would talk to him about how the fact is the people that we as Catholics are called to take the best care of. We call it the preferential option for the poor. Those people are the ones who are suffering the most because of abortion bans and restrictions. And to see the human face and the human toll that this is taking, particularly on women and particularly on poor women and women of color. I think if he could see that, give him the talking points from the Turnaway study, one of my favorite, which is about how those outcomes, 95% of women do not regret their abortion 5 years later. So I think just working on him from that Catholic angle would be so powerful. I just can't get in the room. If anyone can get me in the room, please, let me know after.
May I just add one thing? I think amongst clergy, there's exhaustion, right? How many, they would say, oh, Asians are being attacked, in Half Moon Bay, and do we have to say something again? It's like, yes, you do. Muslims are being attacked. We have to say something. Reproductive justice, we don't have Roe v. Wade. We're tired. Do we have to stand up for everything? That's all. I mean, I know this. I hear the cansancio, the exhaustion. Everyone is tired. But we women are in all of these places. Unless we say, this is us, this is our children, this is going to be my son, my daughter. It's going to be all of us. It cuts through everybody. And I keep just thinking about what turned Vietnam was the streets were just full of people, right? I think that's what it would take to make the government listen. The streets have to be filled with people. How do we get there? We vote, women, we vote.
Thank you. Okay, I saw a bunch of hands jump up, so I will say the blue shirt first, and then the student next to you, and then we'll go to the back. So, right, you and then the student next to you. Yes, perfect. Yeah.
So all four of us are student organizers on campus, and a challenge that we've been having with the events that we've been hosting for reproductive justice have been engaging men in the conversation or to show up. And so two questions. The first is, do you have any advice on how to engage men in this fight, especially given that men are overwhelmingly represented in courts and positions of decision making and companies and places where they dictate healthcare policy for employees? My second question is relatedly, maybe for Rabbi Mira. Overwhelming amounts of clergy are men. How do you engage male rabbis, male ministers to be vocal partners in this conversation?
Okay, so the question was from a group of one of the student organizers from a group that's here, about how we engage men in this conversation and specifically male clergy members. And Jana, I told you I was going to make you talk about strategies, and this is one of Jana's deep passions, actually, is how we engage men in this conversation. But to anyone on the panel, any thoughts about that?
Well, I can perhaps try. One suggestion I would suggest for y'all to try is maybe have conversations on a personal level. I know that'll require a lot more effort and time on an organization that's, during this time particularly already stretched very thin for resources. But I suggest talking to perhaps people who are part of other organizations that advocate for things like climate justice or other forms of economic justice, other forms of advocacy who might have an intersection with abortion, because when it really comes down to it, there are so many issues that intersect with abortion and reproductive justice in general. So I would suggest reaching out to people who are already advocating on those issues, who identify as men, and having those conversations with them at a personal level to see if this is also something that they can include and fold into the advocacy that they're already working on.
And how about any thoughts from anyone on the panel about how to engage male clergy members in particular?
It's not easy. I mean, the most obvious thing is telling them that how it affects them. It's not a women's issue, it's a family issue, it's a national issue, and, it takes two. And I think, unfortunately, when you make it larger than what it is, this is about democracy, this is about separate church and state. If you think, they might think they're safe because they don't have a womb, and maybe if they're that kind of person, it's not their problem, but it'll eventually catch up with them and it will be their problem, because again, it doesn't stop at abortion bans. That's just the first step. That's the low-hanging fruit, because it's women, it's reproductive justice. A lot of people don't even include that in their social justice work, unfortunately. It's like it's not sexy enough in a lot of places. So letting them know that it will have a ripple effect and it will come for them, maybe that is something to open it up and expand the topic. Can I get one?
I also love that you had a male rabbi in the film, so show them.
So I want to say too that you're looking at a failure. I failed. I am a failure. I failed to convince my team when I was working in a synagogue. I told you we were 2 who showed up, right? Other synagogues had busloads of people. We were 2. And we were both speakers. Myself, an Asian woman of color, and my colleague, Rabbi Abby Stein, who is a trans rabbi. I failed.
I don't think you failed. I think that's very harsh. I think you mentioned the Orthodox rabbi, and I just want to touch on that for a second, because getting Rabbi Jeremy Weider to be in the film was, it was something to do. But I think when I asked him to look at the law, like that was the fact. So it's focusing on something very specific and something that he's an expert in. And if you're not going to follow that, then it kind of unravels everything else. And I think it's having people, men or whoever, that are willing to listen, because they're as Muhajir Ali said in the film, it's about the messenger. Who's asking for it? Is it someone that's a part of their congregation, someone that has skin in the game? And I think they will listen to people that have skin in the game. So it's the change from within that I think it starts there, and then it catches on. And you're not a failure. You're like a hero, and I'm glad to be sitting next to you.
There was a question right next to you. Okay, so the question was that we have seen on a lot of issues, a push through business. And so is there anything happening on that front, for example, providing reproductive health care and so on? And again, I'm going to say, Jana, I told you to talk about the strategies. Jana's other deep passion, besides helping men get involved in the movement, is using business to drive change in this space. I'm sure there are many more, but those are two things where make sure you catch up after. But any thoughts from the panel?
Yes. Yes, 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 there are. But first, I want to respectfully disagree with the statement that you said that your vote doesn't count and your voice doesn't count, because it does. Advocacy is a very, very frustrating process, and it takes decades and decades of work to make long-lasting, substantial change for the generations to come. So you have my full empathy. It's a lot of work. It's very frustrating and tiring, but it does matter. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe in a decade, maybe in 2 decades, but it does matter. Regarding your point about the questions of having more corporations fill in the gap on reproductive health care, which also includes abortion, is that it is happening. There are conversations happening. If I recall, after the ruling, there were several companies who publicly came out in support of reproductive health care and justice. I think there's a list publicly available online of all of those corporations. And I know personally of at least one organization which is trying to fill in the gap, so to speak. So to bridge that gap between what corporations are offering in terms of benefits to their employees and abortion and reproductive health care. So those conversations are happening. There is engagement. I don't know how public the engagement might be. I'm speaking from sitting in on coalition meetings and being in these meetings myself, but it's certainly happening. So I think we can hopefully look forward to more private sectors and investment happening along those lines.
Walmart actually is doing a lot. If you look into Walmart, they're providing doula care for all their employees. So it is, and more, even more than that. Sorry? No.
Okay, so there was a question there, and then I'll go to this side. Yeah.
Walgreens.
Okay, so the question is, why aren't we hearing more from medical associations?
I would say reproductive care is very taboo in medical schools. I mean, very few people get the training. It's very hard to get access to training. Even I have a friend who's training right now at Jamaica Hospital. She has to go to some other center somewhere else in Jamaica to get training. It's not taught. Even female reproductive health is there's like, a tiny chapter on it, And so I think that's part of the issue, is that even within medical communities, it's very taboo to talk about abortion. And a lot of doctors are not licensed or certified to provide this care. And I think that's a big part of it. And that's something, I think that's a core fundamental change that has to happen if we're going to have the transformation we want.
Yeah, I mean, ACOG, all their members are across the U.S. So think about, their members are in all different states. It's not just blue states, it's red states, and everyone has their personal views. I mean, we're in the midst of a maternal mortality crisis, which is directly connected with abortion care. It's one conversation. And ACOG, will not put out a statement that structural racism or really any statement about the maternal mortality crisis, and they are the leading organization for obstetrics and gynecology. So that's the landscape, that they're not any different than the rest of the population.
And as a specific example, at the University of Louisville, which is where our doctors at EMW Women's Clinic are actually affiliated, when the trigger ban went into effect, the University of Louisville threatened to cut their positions. And then, in fact, those people have now left the University of Louisville. But that was the only access to reproductive health care training, abortion care training, for any medical student at the University of Louisville, and now that is just gone.
So we have about 5 minutes left. I see a question back there. Actually, if you haven't asked a question yet and you still want to ask, so any other, there's a question right here. Perfect, thank you.
But perhaps in 10 years and 20 years, so that our daughters and sons and grandchildren will have better options and be cared for.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Yep.
A question here, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I wanted to, I guess, obviously, like, there's so many issues here. No one can make a movie about everything, but I wanted to address the issue of like class in these conversations because I think that a lot of these perspectives sometimes are coming from, like they're happening on university campuses, they're happening in upper middle class suburbia, and I think a lot of times we use the language of like, oh, this affects poor women, this affects women of color, but like how do we not just build a coalition, for instance, of interfaith leaders like across faith, but the same like social strata of leadership, and how do we address like low-income, like urban communities of faith, things like that, that have larger contingencies of like actually affected populations.
Okay, so the question is, how do we build interfaith coalitions that are also, really aware of and mindful of class and not reproducing the same sort of stratification that we might see?
Yeah, one of the keys that we're working on is making sure that reproductive justice leaders who are Black women, reproductive justice framework was created by Black women in 1994. A lot of them were religious, a lot of them were reverends. They came out of the Black church. So they're such a fundamental part of the movement, and they very often don't get the credit. But making sure that they're centered, and something we're doing as a coalition is fighting to get them funding, because a lot of Black women, RJ, faith-based leaders are living on Medicaid and trying to do this work. Meanwhile, you have reproductive, rights leaders who are making $500,000 a year, and so there's this horrible, horrible imbalance even within the movement of RJ leaders, finding all sorts of creative ways on a shoestring budget to give care. And so I think that's a key part of it, is making sure we're centering our RJ leaders and making sure they have what they need, because they're working from such scarcity. And so I think that's important. And again, because they know how to communicate with their communities, communicating with the Black church is key to the culture change and narrative change that we need to do. And that's why we really want to invest in our Black women church leaders particularly. And very often, I have someone in our coalition who's a reverend, Black woman reverend. She's interfaith leader. She's putting her life on the line every week right now. She makes no money, and she is airlifting women from Texas to Albuquerque once a week, putting her very life on the line. I don't know anyone else in our movement that's doing that. So it's really important to center them.
I will say also, as we talk about these kinds of coalitions and creating these coalitions, let's not forget the secular organizations as well. Americans United is not a secular organization, but we know that people are increasingly not religious, and we know that the nuns are an increasingly significant portion of our population, and we also know that they overwhelmingly support reproductive justice. So let's keep them in the conversation as well.
So I think we're just at about time. Let's take this one last question and then wrap. Okay, so the question is, how do we hold folks in power accountable for foster care and all the needs that children have after they're born?
I don't know how to hold them. We have to hold them accountable. I think that's what we have to do, and that is through voting and making sure that if they're going to advocate for life, whatever that means to them, then they have to follow through and provide. There should be universal health care. There should be, we should have paid family leave. Even if you're going to have a baby, you should be able to have time to be with that baby. So that's all, and that is all voting. So I don't have other ideas of how to hold, maybe others do, accountable, but I think that's the hypocrisy of the entire thing. And the more we talk about that hypocrisy, I think that will put pressure on them to deliver what they're saying that they care about.
Yeah, and I would like to add to that is that 2 points I'd like to say is that first, I think powerful people like to leave a legacy from my observations. So what is a powerful person's legacy going to be? Is it going to be a legacy of care? Is it going to be a legacy of helping serve the communities that you've been elected to serve? And then second, I think that art helps hold people accountable. Film, dance, music, literature, poetry, any other form of art that you can think about, is because I think art and stories, they touch something in us that no, perhaps litigation can. And that's why I think in litigation we try to make sure that our narratives are very powerfully crafted and carefully done, because stories resonate with people, and we carry our stories and we tell them again and again. They might change over time. We might add a detail here, we might take away a detail, but we say it again and again. And so I think that's another way to hold people accountable is through art.
Thank you. What a perfect way to end this. I so appreciate your time, and I appreciate just the time and attention of everyone here. I think we could have this conversation for hours. And I appreciate all the hope that we shared in it as well. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.